Chapter 8, Part 2 of After the Divorce by Grazia Deledda, translated by Maria Hornor Lansdale. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Denham. During the winter that followed, he suffered intensely from cold. His face and nails were livid, and during the exercise hour, even when he stood in the sun, his teeth chattered like those of an old man. He asked often to confess, and confided all his troubles to the young chaplain. "Who put such ideas as these into your head, my son?" asked the confessor, his dark eyes flashing. "A fellow countryman of mine, the ex-marshal Bourret, the King of Spades they call him." "May God bless and protect you," said the other, becoming thoughtful. He knew the King of Spades well. Then he administered what comfort he could, and asked what Giovanna had written herself, and when. Alas, she wrote but seldom now, and never more than a few lines at a time. It seemed almost as if, after the child's death, she had nothing to write about. In her last letter, she had told him that the weather was bitterly cold, that there had been 2 snowstorms, in one of which a man, while attempting to cross the mountains, had been frozen to death. And then she had added that they were having a famine. These accounts, of course, preyed upon Constantino's mind. He would dream constantly that he had been taken to Nuoro and given his liberty. From thence he would set forth on foot for home. It was cold, bitterly cold. He could go no further. He was dying. Then he would wake up shivering and with a heavy weight on his heart. "You are so weak, my brother," said the confessor. "It is bodily weakness that makes you imagine all these things. Your wife is a good Christian. She would never wrong you in the world. Come, put all such ideas out of your head. You should try to get back your strength. You must eat more and drink something now and then. Are you earning anything?" "A little, but I send it all to my wife. She is so terribly poor." "Oh, I eat plenty, and I don't like to take anything to drink. It gives me nausea." "Well, take heart. I will talk to Bourret. He shall not bother you any more." He did, in fact, have an interview with the King of Spades, and took him severely to task for putting such wicked ideas into Ledda's head. "The poor fellow is far from strong as it is," said he. "If you don't let him alone, he will be ill." Bourret regarded the priest calmly out of his shrewd little pig eyes. Then he gave a puff and shook his head. "I only do it for his own good," he said confidently. "But what good? What possible good? I tell you, my dear fellow, I beg your pardon, but here it is for the present. As long as the cold weather lasts, there is very little to be feared so far as the young woman is concerned. That is, I fancy that now it is only the old one, Constantino's mother-in-law, who is at work, advising and tormenting her daughter not to let her chance slip by. But when the spring comes, then you'll see. That's all." The chaplain's face fell. He was disturbed and puzzled. The other, watching him out of his sharp little eyes, concluded that the present would be a good time to explain himself more fully, and accordingly began to enlarge upon the mother-in-law's grasping disposition, the youth of her daughter, the dangers of the spring season, and so forth. The chaplain now became really angry. "This is too much!" he exclaimed, as he strode up and down, striking the palms of his hands together and his eyes flashing. "How dare you imagine all this string of things that may possibly happen, and then repeat them to that poor creature as though they were actual occurrences? Because the young woman once had another suitor, you mean to say—" "My dear friend, there is no need to get so angry," said the other, Here, look at this." And he showed him the anonymous letter. The chaplain saw at once that the matter was more serious than he had supposed. He read the letter, and then asked if Ledda paid him money. "Of course, a trifle now and then. Perhaps you think it wrong." "Well, don't I take the risk of being put in a cell in order to serve him?" "And you consider that you are doing right when you act in this manner?" "What is doing right? If it is helping your neighbour, then I most certainly think that I am." The chaplain reread the letter attentively. "Yes," pursued the other, "I certainly am. And what is more, if, when I get out of here, they don't reinstate me in my position, I intend to arrange a system of correspondence for all the prisons in Italy. It will be a sort of agency. I see, my friend, that it will not be long before we have you back again. Hey, I shall know how to manage the thing. A secret agency, and pardons too," said the priest, folding the letter and returning it. "How can you have the heart to fool these poor creatures so?" "Yes, pardons too," replied Burai calmly. "Well, and suppose they are fooled? If it gives them any comfort to hope, is not that an act of kindness in itself? What is there for any of us but hope?" "Well," said the other more mildly, "at least do me the favour to leave that poor fellow alone. Allow him to enjoy the pleasures of hope, otherwise he will certainly fall ill." The ex-marshal promised, though with bad grace. It seemed to him a poor method. "He will die of heart-stroke, I verily believe," he said to himself. "Wait till the spring. Then we will see whether a man of the world knows what he is about or no." And he laid one hand on his breast. When they next met, Constantino asked with a smile if he had seen Supraidaru, as they called the chaplain between themselves, and what he had said to them. The ex-marshal was leaning against the damp and dingy wall, softly cursing some individual unknown in the Sardinian dialect.
"Bala ki trapeseca busaka, braskiai."
"I wish a ball would hit him in the pouch, the he-wolf," he murmured as Constantino approached. "What is it? Who?" "Oh, nothing. You want to know if I have seen the priest? Yes, and he scolded me like a child. What a child it is! A little pig, really and truly a little pig, but the lard is yellow and rancid. Do you know, I read somewhere that in Russia they think very highly of rancid lard. But tell me what he said." "What he said? Let me see, what did he say? I don't remember. Oh yes, he told me that I had imagined all that, what we have been talking about. Yes, that was it, my dear fellow. I have, it seems, a vivid imagination, and your wife will never wrong you in the world. Never, as surely as we are standing here." Constantino looked at him eagerly. No, the man was not chaffing. He was perfectly serious, and evidently meant what he said. "Aha! He scolded you, did he? Good enough!" he cried. "This wall," said the King of Spades, straightening himself and regarding his hands, which were red and scarred from contact with the rough stones, "this wall looks as though it were made of chocolate. It is warm and damp. Ah, if it only were! There would be two advantages. We could eat it and then escape. Have you ever eaten any chocolate?" "Why, of course, and Giovanna too. She is very fond of it, but it is fearfully dear." "Well, and what then?" "What then?" exclaimed the other impatiently. "My dear fellow, you drive me crazy. Oh, she will wait for you 23 years, never fear." "No, not that long. I shall be out of here long before that," replied Constantino confidently. "Then, too," he added with a gleam of humour, "there is the pardon. You were to see the king, you know, about a pardon for me." "Precisely," said the other. "I was to see the king. You don't believe me? I shall, however, go to him at once. He receives every official, and what am I if not an official? He is fond of the army, he is young. I hear he is getting fat. Ah, not as fat as I, though," and he laughed. From then on, whenever Constantino tried to bring the conversation around to the old subject, the other contrived to head him off, but at all events he was no longer tormented. One day about this time, Constantino was informed that 5 francs had been paid into his account. "He did it!" he exclaimed. "I am sure it was the priest. What a kind man he is! But I don't need it. No, indeed, I don't need the money at all." "You stupid!" said the King of Spades. "Take it. If you don't, he will be offended. I don't want it. A pretty way that to acknowledge a present." "But I should be ashamed to take it, and what could I do with it anyhow?" "Why, eat, drink. You have need to, I can assure you. You would like to send it home, I suppose. The devil take you! If you do such an idiotic thing as that, I will spit in your face. Why, see here, she doesn't even write to you any more. What is there for her to write about?" said Constantino, trying vainly to think of some excuse. "Besides," he added, "she will be working now. The winter is nearly over." "Yes, it is nearly over, and then the spring will come," said the other in a tone that had almost a menace in it. "It will come." "Why, of course it will come." "When does the warm weather begin with you? We have it in March." "Oh, with us not till June. But then it is so beautiful. The grass grows, oh, as tall as that, and they clip the sheep, and the bees are making honey. An idyll, truly. You don't know what an idyll is? Well, I'll tell you, sometimes it is infidelity. Wait till June. How long is it since you've been to confession?" "Oh, I've not been for a fortnight." "A long time, I declare. What a good Christian you are, my friend. For my own part, I've never been at all. My conscience is as clear and unsullied as a mirror. Now there," said he, pointing to the pasty-faced student, whose hair was so white that it looked as though it had been powdered, "there is one who had better confess without delay. He is knocking now at the door of eternity." Sure enough, only a few days later, the student was removed to the infirmary, and at the end of March he died. Bellini, the man whose mistress was dying of the same disease, asked after him anxiously every day, and when he died, cried for hours in a weak, childish fashion. It was not from any grief he felt at parting from the sick man, but at the thought of what might happen to his mistress. His grief subsided at length, and then, as he no longer had the reminder of the student before his eyes, he gradually came to think less and less about his own sorrow. The death of the student had a totally different effect upon the King of Spades. He became quite melancholy, took to philosophizing about life and death, and would engage in lengthy discussions with the delegate, who rolled his eyes about and expounded his views in a deep bass voice. When talking with Constantino, the ex-marshal was apt to drop into rather homesick reminiscences about the distant land of their birth. "Yes," he said one day, "I was once quite close to your home or its neighbourhood. I can't tell you precisely, but I know there was a wood, all arbute and cork trees and rock roses. It looked as though there had been a rain of blood all over them. And there was a smell, oh, the queerest kind of smell. It was something like tobacco. Then there was a cross on a stone, and you could see the water far away in the distance." "Why, of course," cried Constantino. "That was the forest of Cerbomine, Stagman. I should say I did know it. Once a hunter saw a stag there with golden horns. He fired and shot it dead, but as the stag fell, it gave a cry like a human being and said, 'The penance is completed.' They say it was some human soul that had been forced to expiate a terrible sin of some sort. The cross was erected afterwards." "And how about the horns?" "They say that as the hunter drew near, the horns turned black." "Poof, poof! How superstitious you all are, you peasants! Ah, here is the spring coming at last," he continued, staring up at the sky. "For my own part, the spring gets on my nerves. If I could but go hunting once! There was one time when I was hunting in the marshes near Cagliari. Ah, those marshes! They looked just like ever so many pieces of looking-glass thrown down from somewhere above, and all around there were quantities of purple lilies. A long line of flamingos were flying in single file. They stood out against the sky, which was so bright you could hardly raise your eyes to it. Pum, pum! One of the flamingos fell, the others flew on without making a sound. I rushed right into the middle of the marsh to get the one I had shot. I was as quick and agile as a fish in those days. I was only 18 years old. What are flamingos good for? Nothing. They stuff them. They have great long legs like velvet. Have you ever been in that part of the country? Oh yes, I remember. When you worked in the mines, you passed through Cagliari. I shall go back there some day to die in blessed peace." "You are melancholy nowadays." "What would you have, my friend? It is the spring. It is so depressing to have to pass Easter in prison. I shall take the Easter instruction this year." "I have taken it already." "Ah, you have taken it already?" And the two prisoners fell into a thoughtful silence. Thus April passed by, and May, and June. The dreary prison walls turned into ovens, unpleasant insects came to life, and once more preyed upon the unfortunate inmates. Again the air was filled with sickening odours, and in the workroom, presided over by the same red-faced, taciturn guard, perspiration, fish, and leather fought for preeminence in the fetid atmosphere. Constantino, weaker than ever, suffered tortures from the insects. In former years he had slept so profoundly that nothing could disturb him, but now it was different, and a sudden sting would arouse him with a bound and leave him trembling all over. Then insomnia set in, and periods of semi-consciousness that were worse than actual sleeplessness, haunted as they sometimes were with nightmare. Sharp twinges, not always from insects, shot through his entire body, and he would toss from side to side, gasping and sighing. Sometimes the torture became almost unendurable, and often the orange glow of sunrise would shine through the window before he had been able to close an eye. Then, overpowered by exhaustion, he would fall into a heavy slumber just as it was time to get up. Giovanna had now entirely ceased writing. Once only, towards the end of May, a letter had come begging him not to send her any more money, as she now earned enough to live on with care. After that, there was nothing more. And yet he maintained his tranquil faith in her loyalty. Even this last letter he took as a fresh proof of her affection for him. Every day the King of Spades, waiting for his friend in the exercise hour, would betray a certain anxiety. "Well," he would say uneasily, his sharp little demon eyes snapping out of the big, clean-shaven yellow face. "Well, what news?" And when Constantino would seem to be surprised at the question, he too would look surprised, though he would never say at what. "It is warm weather," he would observe. Yes, very warm. The spring is over. I should say that it was. Have they finished harvesting where you come from?" "Of course they have. My wife says there is no need to send her anything more now." "Ah, I knew that already, my dear fellow." The ex-marshal hardly knew what to think. He was almost annoyed to find that his forebodings were not being verified. One day, however, Constantino failed to put in an appearance at the exercise, and when the ex-marshal was told that his friend had been taken to the infirmary, he felt a strange tightening at the heart. Presently the old magpie came fluttering about, and settling down with a shake of its half-bald, rumpled head, croaked out dismally, "Constanti! Constanti!" "Constanti has had a stroke, my friend," said the King of Spades. The other convicts began to crowd around him curiously, but he waved them all off. "I know nothing about it," he said. "Let me alone." Up to 9 o'clock, Bellini told them, Constantino had been at work with the rest as usual. Then a guard had said that he was wanted, no one knew what for. He had gotten quickly up and gone off with him as white as a sheet, and his eyes starting out of their sockets. He had not returned. To the last day of his life, Constantino never forgot that morning. It was hot and overcast. The shadows of the clouds seemed to hang over the workroom, throwing half of it into deep gloom. The convicts all looked livid by this light. The leather aprons exhaled a strong and very disagreeable odour, and everyone was out of humour. A man who was afraid of ghosts had been telling how in his part of the country long white flowing forms could be seen on dark nights, floating on the surface of the river. He asked Bellini if he had ever seen them. "I? No, I don't believe in such foolishness." "Ah, you think it's foolishness, do you?" said the other in a dull, monotonous tone, and staring into the shoe he was at work on. "Cough," murmured another, without looking up from his work. The believer in ghosts thereupon raised his head with an angry movement, and was about to reply in kind when the first broke in protestingly. "Oh, really?" said he. "Can't I talk to myself? If I choose to say calf, or ram, or sheep, or dog, what business is it of yours? Can't I say things to my shoe, I'd like to know?" It was at this point that the guard had come and called Constantino away, and the latter, who had passed a sleepless night, had opened his drowsy eyes, turned pale, and leapt to his feet. "Who wants me?" he had asked, and then he had followed the guard. He was taken to a dingy room filled with shelves of dusty papers. The dirty windows were closed. Beyond them, through a red grating, could be seen the sky, dull and grey, as though it too were dirty. A man was seated writing at a tall, dusty desk, piled so high with papers that between the papers and the dust the man himself could hardly be seen. As the prisoner entered, he raised a flushed face, the small chin completely hidden by a heavy blonde moustache. He fixed a pair of big, round, dull blue eyes upon Constantino, but apparently without seeing him, for he dropped them again immediately and went on writing. Constantino, who had seen this man before, stood waiting, his heart thumping in his breast. Mechanically, his thoughts dwelt upon the description of the water phantoms he had just been listening to, and the voice saying "cough." He wondered vaguely if one would be justified in feeling angry at that. Not a sound broke the silence of the room except the scratch, scratch of the pen as it travelled over the coarse paper. Again the pale blue eyes were fixed upon the prisoner, and again lowered to the sheet. Constantino, trembling and unnerved, gazed desperately around the room. Still the man wrote on. The prisoner could feel his heart beating furiously. 1,000 dark fancies, hideous, terrifying, rushed through his brain, like clouds driven before an angry tempest. And still the man wrote on and on. Suddenly, without warning, all the dark fancies vanished, dispersed, and swallowed up, as it were, in a single glorious flood of light. A thought so dazzling and beautiful as almost to be painful shot into his mind. "They have discovered that I am innocent." The idea did not remain for long, but it left behind a vague, tremulous light. The man was still writing, and did not stop as he presently said in a loud, hard voice, "You are named?" "Constantino Ledda." "Where from?" "Olei, in Sardinia, province of Sassari." "Very good." Silence. The man wrote a little while longer. Then suddenly he dug his pen into the paper, raised his red face, and fastened his round, expressionless eyes upon the man standing before him. Constantino's own eyes dropped. "Very good. Have you a wife?" "Yes." "Any children?" "We had one, but he died." "Are you fond of your wife?" "Yes," replied Constantino, and raised his terrified eyes as far as the fat red hand resting on the desk, with a ring on one finger having a purple stone, and between the thumb and forefinger the stiff black point of the pen. Not knowing where to fix his perplexed gaze, Constantino followed the movements of this pen, conscious all the while only of a feeling of supreme agony, as when one dreams that he is about to be swallowed up in a cataclysm. The hard voice was speaking again in a low, measured tone. "You know, of course, that your wife's whole life has been ruined by your fault. Young, handsome, and blameless, the rest of her days must be spent in struggle and privation. The world holds out no promise of happiness for her, and yet she has never done any harm at all. As long as your child lived, she endured her lot patiently. Her hopes were fixed upon him. But now that he is dead, what has she left? When you return to her, if indeed God should be so merciful as to allow you to do so, you will be old, broken down, useless, and she will be the same. She sees stretching before her a terrible future, nothing but sorrow, shame, poverty, and a miserable old age. No resource but to beg. Thus her life is a worse punishment even than yours." Constantino, as white as death, panting, agonizing, tried to protest, to say that he would surely be liberated before long, but the words died away on his lips. The other, meanwhile, gave him no chance, but pursued his theme in smooth, even tones, his dull eyes never leaving the prisoner's face. "Her life is thus a worse punishment even than yours. You should think of these things, and abandoning all hope, repent doubly of your crime." He cleared his throat, and then continued in a different tone. "Now, however, the law has provided a means by which this great injustice can be rectified. You, of course, know very well that an act of divorce has gone into effect, which enables a woman whose husband is guilty of a certain class of crime to marry again. Should your wife sit down, keep quiet. Should your wife apply for such a divorce, it would be your duty to grant it at once. I know that you are, or pretend to be, after all, a good Christian. Constantino, who was leaning on the table, shaking in every limb, but making a heroic effort to control himself, now broke in. "Has she applied for it?" he demanded. Sit down there," said the other, motioning with his pen. He wanted to continue his harangue, but Constantino again spoke in a clear, firm voice that contrasted strangely with the trembling of his limbs. "I know my duty perfectly," he said, "and I shall never give my consent. I shall undoubtedly be freed before very long, and then my wife would bitterly repent of her mistake." Two deep wrinkles furrowed the red cheeks of the lecturer, and an ugly smile shone from his dull eyes. "Indeed," he said. "Well, the consent of the prisoner is asked merely as a formality. It is, of course, his duty to give it, and his goodwill counts for something in his favour. But it all comes to the same thing whether he gives it or not. Hey there! What? Why? What is the matter?" For Constantino had given a sudden lurch, and collapsed on the floor like a bundle of limp rags. End of chapter 8. Recording by Tom Denham.